If anyone were to ask me who my favourite Batman villain is, I would respond within 2 seconds, saying that it was Two-Face. However, I always caveat that statement, if anyone is really that interested, by saying that I think his most interesting foe is Clayface. And that's primarily because of how he's been presented in the seminal Batman the Animated Series. A tragic figure, completely and utterly repugnant with few redeeming qualities. He's shallow, vain, and desperate to maintain the fragile link to his core self. And yet this characterization was entirely the creation of the BTAS creative team. Prior to this, there had been several different Clayfaces in the comics, with each of them being pretty distinct. First you had the murderous Basil Karlo, who wore a mask and stabbed people. Then you had treasure hunter Matt Hagen, who discovered a secret pool of protoplasm that temporarily allowed him to change his shape. The third was Preston Payne, a deformed scientist that wanted to change the way he looked, with tragic results. And finally there was Sondra Fuller, whose shape-changing abilities were permanent. They all worked fine in the comic books, but in my opinion, a shape-shifting character like Clayface is probably best suited to animation, because these abilities lend themselves incredibly well to the medium. A live-action Clayface, while not impossible, is very much limited by budget, while animation can allow for some radical transformations. But budget will always be a consideration when it comes to determining how elaborate those transformations can be. Sure, comics let artists draw whatever they like without concerning themselves with budgets, but drawings don't move, and this lack of motion lessens the impact of the transformations to my eye. And Clayface has appeared in several different animated series over the decades. Almost every version of the character has been able to alter his appearance. For some versions, this is a temporary ability. Other times, it's a permanent thing. Sometimes he hates what he's become. Other times, he loves being who he is. While Clayface has appeared in almost every major animated Batman series, there are 5 versions of the character that I want to talk about today. 1977's The New Adventures of Batman, 1992's Batman the Animated Series, as well as 1997's The New Batman Adventures, 2004's The Batman, 2020's Harley Quinn, and 2024's Batman Caped Crusader. Also, I haven't forgotten about his appearances in shows like Batman the Brave and the Bold, where he only appeared in the Scooby-Doo crossover movie and pretended to be a ghost, and Young Justice. Most of Clayface's appearances in that show took place in the tie-in comics, although it is noteworthy that this is one of the few versions of Clayface that was successfully rehabilitated. I don't think his appearances in those other shows are major enough to discuss in depth, but let me know if you disagree. Maybe I can revisit them in the future. With that aside, let's talk about the very first animated version of Clayface, as seen in The New Adventures of Batman. Now, in terms of animation, this show may seem crude now, but it was fairly typical of the shows of the time. Just compare it to contemporaries like Captain Caveman or Scooby-Doo. There are a lot of similarities. Having said that, I find their version of Clayface to be particularly tedious. Their Clayface is a common thief that gets involved in stealing oil in 2 separate stories. I guess the writers were still reeling from the oil crisis in the 70s. Like all of the villains in this show, he doesn't really have compelling motivations, he just wants to steal things. There, Matt Hagen uses a secret potion to give himself shape-changing powers for 24 hours. And this is actually a plot point at least once. Batman pursues Clayface to the point that his powers wear off, making it much easier to arrest him. But the most disappointing thing to me is the way their Clayface transforms. All that happens is a fuzzy light and then his body fades into his new form. Now, of course, this is because of budgetary restrictions, but it doesn't stop it from being any less dull. And to make matters worse, in one episode when Batmite confronts Clayface in the Batcave, almost all of his transformations happened off-screen, as Batmite described what he was turning into. The things he transformed into weren't particularly imaginative either. A snake, a shark, Batman. There's just no style. He's just another interchangeable villain for the most part, especially in the story in which he teams up with Catwoman to steal oil. You could swap him out for the Penguin or the Joker and the story would be mostly the same. Now, with that disappointment out of the way, let's talk about the definitive version of Clayface as seen in Batman the Animated Series. In terms of characterization and imaginative use of his powers, this version is light years ahead of what we had seen previously. While he may not be Batman's best villain, I think he is the most interesting. The first thing that leaps out at me is that when we first meet their Matt Hagen, he is already Clayface. He uses a chemical compound called Renew You to shape his face. provided to him by the nefarious Roland Daggett, and it lasts for 24 hours, much like the version seen in the New Adventures of Batman. However, applying this formula only allows him to alter his face. He isn't motivated by greed either, he's motivated by vanity. He was a handsome actor whose face was disfigured in a car crash, and he uses the formula to restore his lost looks and maintain his lifestyle. But the price he has to pay for this formula is too high. He has to impersonate Daggett's enemies to help cover up his wrongdoing. And when he fails to kill Lucius Fox while disguised as Bruce Wayne, Hagen's supply of the chemical is cut off. When he attempts to steal as much as he can, Daggett's men set upon him and pour a whole container of the formula down his throat. I've talked at length about all of the rich subtext in Clayface stories around identity, gender, victimhood, masculinity, and addiction. I could probably write a whole book about this character and his motivations, and may yet do one day. Let me know if you'd like to see that. But this is a stark contrast to what we had seen previously, even in the comic book source material. This Clayface takes full advantage of the medium of animation, with some tremendous transformations. Frankly, Clayface's meltdown in the Galaxy Broadcast Control Room is one of the greatest technical accomplishments in animation, made all the more impressive by the fact that it was all drawn and painted by hand, and in my opinion, it has yet to be topped. Almost every story featuring this Clayface deals with rich, complex themes, from Mudslide's look at disease, body horror, and sexuality, to Growing Pain's story of abuse, neglect, and love. Of all of the versions of Clayface, Beatas's has the most depth and genuinely repulses me, which is why I think he's brilliant, an awful person, but a fascinating character. And that's probably why the comic book version of Clayface adopted so many of the characteristics of Beatas's Clayface. Beatas's Clayface was an amalgamation of all four of the comic book Clayfaces, taking the elements that worked well while embellishing them, and stripping away the unnecessary stuff. This was actually the subject of my very first video essay a few years ago, which I will link to in the info button in the top right corner. Go watch that if you've never seen it before. But after this video, please. Now, the reason I bring up multiple Clayfaces again is because the next Batman cartoon, the aptly named The Batman, had two Clayfaces. The first was more in line with the Beatas version in that he was a tragic figure, someone whose humanity was ripped away from him, while the second was more in the mould of a traditional villain, someone that gave up his humanity to become powerful. Their first Clayface was Detective Ethan Bennett, who was unintentionally exposed to fumes from the Joker's Joker Putty, a substance that could turn anything it was applied to into putty. Bennett had been part of a duo of detectives that had been tasked with bringing Batman in, and he was also best friends with Bruce Wayne, which was awkward. After he had been kidnapped and psychologically tortured by the Joker in a scene that was very reminiscent of the Killing Joke comic book, I might add, Bennett was put on leave. This exposure to the chemical and the psychological torture from the Joker led to Bennett becoming Clayface. As Clayface, Bennett would try to do the right thing, but would always go too far, giving in to his darker urges. With the support of his partner Ellen Yin and his best friend Bruce Wayne, he attempted to go straight after completing his treatment at Arkham, but it was no good. While he may not have technically been insane anymore, his experiences as Clayface left its mark on him. Bennett found himself wondering if he could just control himself. Wouldn't that be wonderful? Maybe, just maybe, being Clayface would be better than being plain old Ethan Bennett. It was established that if he stopped using his powers, over time they would reduce, to the point that he almost wouldn't have them. But he could not help himself. It may have started out as a desire to do good and capture the Joker, but really, Clayface is the real him, the person he kept buried beneath the surface. Bennett decided not to become human again. He'd always be known as Clayface no matter what he did, and trying to rebuild his life would just be too hard. Instead, he wanted an easier life, and that meant a life of stealing. The second Clayface was failed actor Basil Karlo, who chose to ingest a concentrated version of the Clayface mutagen to help him get acting gigs. He felt that his appearance was the thing that was holding him back, but really it was his lack of talent and he just couldn't see it. All he wanted was for everyone to know his face, and by becoming the new Clayface, he sort of got his wish. The only way to stop Karlo was to unleash a repentant Ethan Bennett on him, and while the two fought, Batman could administer a cure. While both Clayfaces were given the cure by Batman, it seems that Bennett was the only one that reverted back to normal. Carlo, meanwhile, seemed to get his powers back after a little while and resumed his criminal career. These versions of Clayface are absolutely fine. They may even be your favourite, and that's okay. Personally, I view them, particularly Ethan Bennett, as Clayface light. Still fairly tragic, but no way near as emotionally heavy as the version seen in BTAS. Basically, they're more child-friendly, and I'm not saying that's a bad thing, it's just not to my tastes. The next most prominent version of Clayface can be seen in HBO's Harley Quinn animated series. This Clayface is a comedy character that, despite his fantastic powers, thinks of himself as a performer above all else. He's camp, over the top, and completely oblivious to what a ham he is. No origin is provided, but he is very happy about having these abilities. There's no tragedy in his stories, apart from maybe that time he got split in two and fell in love with his own lower half. The tragedy came when it was revealed that the two could never touch, lest they absorbed each other and became a single being again, which of course happened. While the show is mostly about Harley Quinn trying to be her own person, completely separate from the Joker, much of the series deals with her relationship with other characters, including her gang members, which consists of King Shark, Poison Ivy, Dr. Psycho, Frank the Plant, Cyborgman, and Clayface. Clayface is Harley's friend, even if she doesn't respect him all that much. He's incredibly self-absorbed and is always looking for ways to boost his profile as an actor. Eventually, he gets his wish when he stars in an incredibly popular one-man show in Las Vegas and becomes one of the most popular entertainers in the world. Once he achieves his dream, he leaves his friends behind and becomes an utter diva. One of the things I like about this version of the character is how they took established elements of the character, themes of identity, self, and the destructive power of fame, and flipped it on its head. There's virtually no tragedy here, and honestly, he's not much of a criminal. Every experience he has is all part of his mission to further his craft as an actor and become a star. It just so happens that he has superpowers that lend themselves very well to a life of crime. Ultimately, despite his impressive powers, he's just a narcissistic actor looking to boost his ego. And this brings me very nicely to the latest version of Clayface, as seen in Batman Caped Crusader. Once again, he is actor Basil Karlo, and while he is successful, he's dissatisfied with his lot in life. Basil is always cast as the villain, but he desperately wants to be the romantic lead, and to win the heart of his co-star Yvonne Francis. Karlo pumps all of his money into the development of a serum that would allow him to change his face, which he believes to be the source of all of his problems. However, when the formula proves to be an incredible success, he can literally mold his face into anything he wants. He comes to realise that it was never his face that was the problem. That was just an excuse he told himself. The reality is that he's a self-important, creepy loser, and altering his face won't change that fact. But the ability to change his appearance to become anyone empowers Karlo. He realises that he can now do whatever he wants, whenever he wants to. And what he wants to do is get revenge on the people that made him feel small. He murders his rivals as well as a producer and kidnaps the object of his affection with the aim of recreating one of the scenes from his movies before he kills her. And that's one of the things I really love about Caped Crusader's version of Clayface. It's all the references to the classic Hollywood horror films. His design is beautifully streamlined, almost to the point that he's just a silhouette, with a creepy, disfigured face leering out of the darkness. That face isn't what he really looks like. I'm not sure what he looks like anymore now that his face is completely malleable, but this is what he chooses to look like. He could be anyone or anything, and let me just repeat this. He chooses to look this way. He wants to frighten and disgust people. He wants to be the villain, hence the episode's title. He is irredeemably awful and not at all sympathetic in any way, shape or form. Just look at his reaction when he realises that the reason Yvonne wouldn't date him wasn't because of the way he looked, but because of who he was. His charming facade melts away. He gets angry and he lashes out at her. He's only had one appearance so far, but what an episode. I don't know what else they could do with him or even if he will appear in Caped Crusader Season 2, but I really like this version of the character. Out of all of the versions of Clayface, I think that the BTAS version is the most influential, to the point that his origin is now the origin of the comic book Clayface. barring a few minor changes. I know there are fans of the Ethan Bennett version of Clayface primarily because of his close connection to Bruce Wayne, and the fact that he was an established character long before he was unintentionally turned into Clayface. I'm sure there are also people that are glad that he got his redemption and was cured. But I'm a big fan of sad stories that don't have happy endings, and I really like the emotional complexity of Beat-Ass's Clayface. Their Matt Hagen is undeniably an awful person, even before his transformation, but he didn't deserve what happened to him, and that makes him somewhat sympathetic, although your mileage may vary there. And I like this recurring theme with these Clayfaces, that the power brings out the worst in them, the power of becoming someone else, of blending into a crowd, and becoming anonymous empowers them to act out their true desires. Sometimes he just wants money, sometimes it's fame he seeks, and sometimes he just wants to make himself feel powerful. They could be anyone, but they always choose to be selfish, awful people.
Okay, that's it for this week's essay. If you liked the video, don't forget to like, share, subscribe, leave a comment, tell all your friends about me. You know how YouTube works. If you really enjoyed the video and have the means, please consider making use of the thanks button to send a buck or two my way, because every little helps. I offer channel memberships for $1.99 a month. This will get you early access to my weekly video essay, priority responses to your comments, members-only videos, custom emojis, and an icon on your profile indicating that you're one of my people. And special thanks to my current channel members, who are all listed on the screen right now.
Next time I'm going to continue my villain comparison series by looking at the various animated versions of Catwoman. Of all the villains, I think she has been presented in the most consistent way across the various animated series. But some versions are better than others. Hope to see you then.